Alright folks, so I'm going to start this video with a warning to the audience. Some details and events discussed in this video are quite disturbing. Everything I'm about to say is based on true historic events that took place on the island of Taiwan. Be prepared. This video will focus on the 228 incident and the White Terror. This is when the island was put under martial law for 40 years by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang Party. These events were heavily censored by the Taiwanese government until the mid-1990s. Tens and thousands of civilians were brutally murdered, tortured, imprisoned, disappeared, some burned alive. Anybody that spoke up about these events during the White Terror could be expelled from school, they could lose their job, have their business and assets frozen by the governments, and even sentenced to death by execution. I learned about the details of many of these events when I personally visited the island this past spring back in May of 2023, and I witnessed the display at the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial in Taipei. I highly recommending for you guys to pay a visit here. The Western propaganda media, they always want to paint China and Russia as the faces of evil. The Western media, they always want you to focus on what happened on Tiananmen Square in 1989. And they want to focus on China's strict censorship, the fact that they have no freedom of speech. They want to talk about the Muslim Uyghurs in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region. They want to talk about the Tibetan rebellions. But let me tell you something. What, you think there's freedom of speech in the West? You can't even define what a woman is. If you think that only China is bad, you are so naive. I agree that, listen, Chairman Mao Zedong, he did some crazy things, especially in his later days. But he was the right leader for China. Because if Mao Zedong and his Red Army lost the Chinese Civil War, if it was the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek that won the war in China, I honestly believe that China would be worse off today. And the evidence are honestly, they're crystal clear. If you look at what happened to the island of Taiwan, look at how he led a dictatorship and a totalitarian regime in Taiwan from 1949 until his death in 1975. Let's talk about the history of the island a little bit for you to understand this conflict. So it is the summer of 1683. This is when China was at its peak glory. China was the #1 economy in the world, a global superpower. It's estimated that during this time period, 33%, 1/3 of the world's GDP was generated by China. This is mainly due to their monopoly of tea production. And I've covered parts of it in my video regarding the trader Hao Kwa, how he went from an orphan to a billionaire. And China actually drained the silver reserves of the British government. This was subsequently led them to the Opium War and the destruction of Qing Dynasty China. So in the late 1600s, China was led by their most legendary emperor, Emperor Qianlong. He ruled China for 61 years. And during this time, Taiwan, this island was first discovered by the Portuguese sailors. It was known as Formosa, or a beautiful isle. And during this time period, there are many ethnic Chinese fishermen that traveled to the island from the Fujian province, from mainland China. And they would go on to settle on the island, along with some other aboriginal population. And the Qing Dynasty China, they always viewed Taiwan as part of China because Mandarin Chinese was widely spoken on the island. And then many of their cultures and their customs mirrored mainland China. So during the summer of 1683, and the Qing Dynasty Navy would arrive at the Tuning Kingdoms. At first, they would attempt negotiations, but all forms of negotiations for peace failed after 2 months. So Qing Dynasty China would launch a full-scale invasion, and the Tuning Emperor, he would end up slicing his own throat in front of a cliff. Taiwan would be annexed, and it would become a part of Chinese history for the next 211 years. From 1894 to 1895, during the First Sino-Japanese War, China would lose the island, along with Korea, to the Japanese. Yes, Korea used to be a Chinese puppet state. And the Japanese would go on to capitulate on September 2nd of 1945, officially ending the Second World War. So after Chiang Kai-shek, he lost to Mao Zedong and his Red Army in 1949. This is possibly the greatest military upset of all time. And Chiang Kai-shek, he would retreat to the island of Taiwan, and he claimed to be the sole legitimate ruler of China, all the way until his death in 1975. If you're wondering, so how come Chairman Mao Zedong, why didn't he attack and take Taiwan in 1949 or 1950? To put it simply, he couldn't. During this time, Mao Zedong, he had no Navy or Air Force, and the U.S. Navy was already set to intervene if any conflict broke out, just like how they came into the Korean War. Plus, fighting on mainland China during their civil war, even though Mao Zedong declared victory in October of 1949, the fighting between the two sides would continue until roughly 1959, a full decade later. And in Chiang Kai-shek's final 26 years on the island of Taiwan, he would make many attempts to attack the mainland as well. All of them ended up in vain. So technically, the Chinese Civil War, which started shortly after the death of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, back in 1927. It is still going on to this day, 97 years later. And one of the main reasons why Chiang Kai-shek he lost the war was because many of his commanders, spies, and soldiers, they betrayed him and they turned into communists. This is also the reason why he formed the First United Front, along with Mao Zedong, to turn against the Imperial Japanese troops' advance. And his commanders actually kidnapped him, and they forced him to join forces with Mao Zedong, or he would be killed. So yes, Mao Zedong, he actually had a chance to kill Chiang Kai-shek himself, but chose not to. He chose to form an alliance instead, and to focus on the Japanese. So after Chiang Kai-shek's defeat, he was extremely paranoid, and he followed his belief. This is known in Chinese as 宁可错杀一千，也绝对不放过一个. This roughly translates to, it doesn't matter if I wrongfully murder 1,000 innocent civilians, as long as I can kill just one communist amongst them, then that is okay. So Taiwan was ruled under a totalitarian regime for many decades. Now, under the Imperial Japanese rule for 5 decades, Taiwan experienced many economic reforms and increased standards of living. Japan had to do this because Taiwan was being used as a supply base during their conquest of Asia. And because of this, Taiwan remains very friendly to Japan to the modern day. If you ever visit the island, you will see a lot of Japanese tourists down there. That could all change, obviously, with the political tensions today. However, Chiang Kai-shek, he would reverse many of these policies put in by the Japanese. And when he returned to Taiwan, Taiwan will be placed under a strict communist, socialist, totalitarian regime. Everything was to be monopolized by the government. These things included sugar, tobacco, tea, paper, petroleum, oil, refining, mining, and cement. The list goes on and on. Everything had to be monopolized by the government, and his policies would lead to against running black markets, out of control inflations. I'll give you one example. The price of rice in Taiwan from 1946 to 1947, in just 1 year, jumped by over 400%. Yes, you heard that correctly. And the government was forced to print paper bills with the denominations of 1 million Taiwan dollar. This caused massive food shortages, leading to famine and cannibalism to break out through the island. And obviously, many people, they were fed up with these brutal government policies, and many turned into selling goods from the black markets in order to make ends meet. Then came the fateful day. It is February 27th, 1947. A Tobacco Monopoly Bureau enforcement team, yes, that's what they were actually called, they confiscated the contraband cigarettes from a 40-year-old widow. Her name is Lin Jiangmai, and this event took place at the Tianma Tea House. So when the widow demanded the return of her cigarettes, the soldiers chose violence, and she was struck in the head with the butt of his gun. And many bystanders, they would see this, and they would quickly surround these bureau troops, and huge arguments broke out in the crowd. And amidst all of this chaos, of course, just like what happened in Boston in the United States, there was a shot that was heard around the world. This shot was fired into the crowd, and it killed an innocent bystander. He would die the next day, February 28th, 1947. This event will go on to be known as the 228 incident. The protesters, outraged, they will swarm the Governor General's office, demanding the prosecution of these bureau soldiers. And the radio stations was taken by the protesters. The event was broadcasted to all of Taiwan, causing chaos and protests to break out everywhere. The Taiwanese soldiers were ordered to open fire on civilians, and at least 3 civilians were killed, along with dozens injured on March 4th. And by that same evening, martial law was declared. on the entire island of Taiwan. This martial law will last for almost 40 years. Anybody that violated the martial law would be executed on sight. In the week that followed, over 1,000 people suspected to be communists from mainland China were killed in various fashions. Throughout the month of March, Governor General Chen Yi, he ordered the execution of anybody that was suspected to be an organizer of these protests. This included anybody that was part of their family, that was a relative, or even their friends. Sometimes soldiers, they would drive by on the streets in military vehicles and open fire indiscriminately into the crowd. Up to 4,000 people will be executed by rapid gunfire alone. By the end of March, the Taiwanese Central Executive Committee dismissed Governor General Chen Yi due to his merciless brutality. He was sentenced to death and he will be executed on June 18, 1950. The total death toll from the 228 incident varies greatly depending on the source, anywhere from 10,000 to 28,000 civilians. Thousands of more will be tortured, imprisoned, or disappeared. The martial law imposed after the 228 incident, this will become known as the White Terror, and this is known in Chinese as 白色恐怖. At least 140,000 people were imprisoned by the Taiwanese government during this time period, many without reason or without charge. Any mentioning of the events related to the 228 incident or the White Terror during this time period could lead to imprisonment and torture for life, sometimes even death sentence. Here are just a few of the many famous incidents that took place during this time period. On July 13th of 1949, this is the Penghu Island incident, where a group of high school students, all of them minors, refugees from the Shandong province of mainland China, they were forced to be conscripted as soldiers. Because many students refused the force for conscription, 2 principals and 5 students were executed for attempting to report this incident. In 1952, the Luku incident, which 35 people were executed and 98 more at least would be imprisoned and tortured by the Taiwanese government. In 1954, a Soviet civilian tanker was privateered in high sea with 49 crews being tortured and detained for 34 years. You heard that correct. 49 crews being tortured and detained for 34 years, leading to at least 3 deaths. In 1955, over 300 subordinate officers of a pro-British and pro-American general, Sun Liren, was arrested, tortured, imprisoned for treason as communist spies. Sun Liren was put under house arrest for 33 years until 1988. Between 1979 to 1980, perhaps the most famous incident during the White Terror, over 100 pro-democracy activists were arrested after a protest on December 10th of 1979. Many of the activists were tortured in prison. 8 of them were court-martialed for rebellion. 37 were charged in civilian courts. 91 of them will be eventually released after torture in jail. This event will become later known as the Kaohsiung incident. Also, during the Kaohsiung incident, democracy activist Lin Yirong's mother and his 2 daughters would be stabbed to death on February 28, 1980. This was ordered by the Taiwanese government. You heard me correct. His entire family was stabbed to death by the Taiwanese government. In 1984, journalist Henry Liu, he was assassinated in his home in Daly City, California. Yes, this is someone who escaped to the United States for writing negative opinions on the then Taiwanese president Jiang Qingguo. In 1987, the Lieyu massacre, 19 refugees were killed by the military. This is all part of the Cold War operations, and the evidence was destroyed by the Taiwanese government. This is one of the final chapters of the White Terror. If you want to see the full list, once again, visit the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall in Taipei. All of the details are embedded in the walls. All of the details are translated into English. I did not make up any of these. So, do you still believe that Taiwan is a free and democratic society? The martial law will finally be lifted on July 15th, 1987, more than 40 years after the 228 incident. And the Taiwanese temporary provisions against communist rebellion was finally ended on September 21st, 1992. The Taiwanese people could only openly discuss these events from 1995 onwards. It is still highly controversial to the present day. For example, If a university student decides to write an essay regarding the 228 incident and regarding the White Terror that negatively portrays Chiang Kai-shek and the actions of Taiwanese military and their government during this time period, he or she could possibly fail the class despite only writing facts and giving out the honest opinions. Listen, Taiwan's a beautiful island. As long as there's long-term peace and stability, that is. Taiwan's not a country. There are only 13 nations left on Earth that recognizes Taiwan as a independent sovereign nation. If you want peace for the nearly 24 million people living on the island, then you must return to China via diplomacy. It is the only option. I know it's not perfect, but it is what is necessary. In Mike Tyson's words, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Among Taiwan's voters under 35 today, only 6% supported China reunification. Listen, nobody will be shouting and protesting on the streets when missiles are raining down on them. The millennials and the Gen Z in Taiwan today, they have never lived through the martial law or the White Terror. They don't know the horrors of war. Taiwan's election is coming up 1 week from today. And the Democratic Progressive Party is projected to win this election. Their two candidates, Lai Chang-ching and Xiao Mei-qin, who, by the way, Xiao Mei-qin worked in Washington, D.C. as a Taiwanese diplomat to the USA for 3 years. And she was also there as a part of Joe Biden's inauguration. These two, they will lead Taiwan to destruction. Mark my words, whether you like it or not, China and the CPP, they will never accept a two-state solution, and Taiwan will always be on their target list. History is complicated. It's never black and white. It is always somewhere in between. Sometimes there's no right or wrong, but there's always the option of chaos or peace. So, what will be the future of Taiwan, or possibly the future of world peace? The youths of Taiwan today,